Hello Internet, my name is the Golden Stalfos, and today we're following up on our series of the biggest problems that the big three trading card games have. Today's topic, of course, is the power level of individual cards. Now, there are lots of different ways you can judge the individual power level of a card, and what's most important depends on the exact underlying mechanics of your game. For example, in Magic the Gathering, Divination is a powerful-ish, but not exactly overwhelming card. But in Yu-Gi-Oh! Pot of Greed, which is, strictly speaking, worse than Divination, is so broken it's been banned since the ban list existed. So what exactly creates a very powerful card kind of depends on the context of the game. In Magic the Gathering, Divination isn't the most overpowered thing in the world because, one, more powerful draw spells exist. Two, there's a much greater abundance of less powerful draw spells. You can literally build a deck where every single card has a draw one effect in addition to its regular effect. And three, mana costs. Because you have to pay mana for the card, the value of drawing extra cards is smaller, because even though you have more cards in hand, they aren't necessarily useful if you don't have the mana to play them. And of course, the last thing is that because Magic the Gathering has this situation where cards can be dead, they crank the power level of individual cards to the max. So something like Divination may not be seen as incredibly powerful when you could play another card that has much more impact on the board for the same cost. Now, that said, Divination is still considered to be too powerful for standard play, and that's why it hasn't been printed in years, but, you know. So with all that in mind, what are some of the most basic ways to assess the power level of a card and figure out if it's too high or too low for your game? So the number one way to measure a card is how it affects your resources. Games like Magic the Gathering or Pokemon have two kinds of resources. They have the cards themselves and the mana or energy. There are also games like Yu-Gi-Oh! That only have cards as resource, and I guess life points, but you can also use life points as a resource in the other games too. In a game like Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards have to restrict when they can be played or how they can be played, because there's no other real cost that you can have beyond paying life points or discarding cards. And the impact of a card is very easily measured in what it does to the board. How many cards are on the board or in the hand before you play the card versus after you play the card. Any card that increases the number of cards you have on the field or in your hand is called a plus. Any card that decreases that is called a minus. That in and of itself is pretty simple, but you also have to compare it to your opponent's board. For example, if you have 5 cards in hand, 5 cards on the field, your opponent has 5 cards in hand, 6 cards on the field, you are at a net -1. They have one more available resource than you do. Obviously, as with in everything in life, having more resources leads to more success, or at least greater opportunity for success. So, for example, if your opponent has 2 monsters or creatures or Pokemon or whatever on the field, and you cast a spell that would kill one of them, you get rid of one of your cards, you get rid of one of their cards, that's an even trade. They call that +0. However, sometimes this is more complicated because playing a very powerful monster or creature or Pokemon can take up resources. And if the card you use to kill that thing takes up less resources, then you actually kind of have a net positive. Let's say, for example, you're playing Magic the Gathering, and your opponent is on turn 6. They've curved out, and they drop their big 6-drop monster. And you immediately hit that card with something like Cast Down or Walk the Plank. So you effectively killed their 6 mana creature with a 2 mana card. Now, that's a +0 in card economy, but it's also basically time walk because your opponent wasted their entire turn doing nothing, and now you get to have your turn. This is why in games where all cards have universal cost, like mana, you should probably consider comparing the cost of the card you're able to destroy to the card you're using to destroy it, and create some sort of equivalency between them. It's not unreasonable for a destruction card to be slightly more efficient than a creature card, but it shouldn't be, you know, time walk efficient. Obviously, it's not actually the same as time walk because your opponent still gets to do other things. Like, if they have any other creatures out, they can attack. But, like, you know. Magic mostly tries to get around this by designing protection on creatures rather than balancing out the cost of destruction spells. But I think that's the wrong way to go because you can't put the same level of protection on every creature. And, like, you know, especially when you're designing for standard and you have like an intentionally lowered power ceiling and you have to like artificially cut out protections because they're too strong for the standard meta and like yeah, it's a whole mess. That actually brings me to one other thing. The power level of a card might be measured not in how much it impacts the board immediately, but in how hard it is to get rid of. This is why, for example, some very powerful cards like the Egyptian gods in Yu-Gi-Oh aren't actually very good. Um, they can have really high attack values and cool effects, but they don't stick around very long and they cost a lot to summon, so they end up not being worth it. If you don't believe me, DZ has an entire video dedicated to this. You can watch that. The long and short of it is they don't really have any protection effects. Obelisk can't be targeted, but I mean, most destruction effects don't target. Dark Hole came out in Legend of Blue Eyes, and it doesn't target. Never has. So, like, eh? Same thing goes for stuff like Regeki and Mirror Force, which aren't even good by today's standards. Which is why in modern times cards are much more likely to be printed with protection first and cool effects second. It also matters what kind of protection they have. For example, in Yu-Gi-Oh, being immune from destruction by battle isn't anywhere near as good as being immune from destruction by card effects. And that's not as good as being immune from, being returned to the hand or, you know, something like that. Magic, of course, has a similar hierarchy in its destruction effects. Cards can have indestructible, which means they aren't destroyed by damage or destruction effects directly, but they can still be destroyed if their stats drop too low or if they're hit by, removal that doesn't destroy. They can also be locked down by effects that, don't destroy a card but do make it effectively useless. Then there are cards with hexproof, which can't be directly targeted but can be hit by field nukes or, anything else that affects more than one card at a time. Now, in Magic the Gathering, widespread effects like this are much rarer than they are in, say, Yu-Gi-Oh, but still, they come up quite a bit. Now, this isn't to say that having, good protection effects is enough to make a card powerful. For example, in Yu-Gi-Oh, there's a card called Venom Naga, which was printed in 2007 or something. And it's got some of the best protection in the entire game still to this day. And it's totally worthless because you can't summon it. You have to activate a trap card off of a specific monster destruction, and that monster is a tribute monster that has specific conditions for its summoning. It's a whole mess. But if you can get Vim and Onaga on the field, not only is it basically impossible to kill, it also has its own win condition. Like, damn. And yet, no one has ever played it because it's not possible. So you don't just need to consider what impact the card has on the board, or what the card can do over its lifetime, or how hard it is to get rid of the card during its lifetime, but also what does the card cost you? Because it doesn't matter how amazing it is, if it's impossible to summon, no one's going to summon it. You know? I mean, Emrakul may be the most busted thing since the Black Lotus, but good luck summoning one without the other. That's not true. Actually, people play Emrakul without paying its mana cost, because there are cards in Magic that let you do that, because, like, what's the point of having a cost system if you can just bypass it, right? Um, whatever, I already talked about that at length in one of my videos about Magic Gathering in the past, but yeah. But even more important than any of that is considering what the power level of other cards are and relative power level, right? Like, Emrakul is great until you throw 15 flying squirrels at it. Um, like, that's. And it's also worth considering, you know, not just how other cards could affect your card, but also like how your card affects everything else. Right? Like, for example, I mean, this hasn't been relevant for a long time, but back in the day, um, Blackluster Soldier, the good one, the Envoy of the End, got, or Envoy of the Beginning, whichever, got banned because it was just way too good to basically just pull two random things out of your graveyard and then have a really strong monster that can destroy shit and attack in the same turn. Like, that was completely busted at the time. And the reason it was busted is because it had basically no cost, because just two random things out of the graveyard, which, you know, are already dead, right? Like, you don't need them anymore. You're not giving anything up for that. And it just, you know, it can destroy something for free, right? Very little cost, very high impact on the board. You know, you get a +1 when you summon the thing because you're not taking resources off the field to do it. And you can put your opponent at a minus as soon as you activate his effect. Very, very strong at the time. Nowadays, probably not so much. I think it's still on the list, though. I honestly don't keep up with the ban list all that much because I don't play Yu-Gi-Oh! All that much anymore. I mostly just watch the reactions from people that I like to watch, like DZ. But they usually only talk about what's changed, not what's been there for the last 15 years, so I don't know. But anyway. Of course, nowadays that effect isn't fast enough or strong enough to compete with the meta because there are lots of cards that would be protected from his effect, and there are lots of cards that can disrupt his summoning condition, and, you know, things like that. But, yeah. And as time has passed, we've got more and more cards that actually do require cards be removed from the graveyard to use them, which means that now it actually does kind of count as a cost, and you might be better off using those resources for something that came out more recently. Or at least something that synergizes better with your overall deck strategy. Which, of course, leads into the discussion of power creep. How do you know when something is too strong? And more importantly, how do you keep building strength forever? Because that's how you sell more cards, right? Personally, I don't think power creep is really necessary. There are a few ways around it. For example, in Magic the Gathering, you have a cost-based system. You also have standard rotation. And because of those two things, you can print cards in standard that have a maximum power level, right? Now, in the last couple of years, they've fucked that up a lot, and that's why there's been so many standard cards getting banned out of the format. You know, Oko. But still, the fact is they're able to lay out a handful of cards that act as reference points and say, okay, we're not printing pacifism anymore, we're printing luminous bonds, right? And obviously sometimes they screw this up, like for example, or seem to, but for example, cast down is strictly better than murder if you have a viable target. But because it has a more narrow target list, and because some of the most powerful targets in the game aren't going to be options, it's okay. And Magic the Gathering actually has been doing this for a while, where they say, okay, this is the power level of standard from now on. We're going to print this card at this cost instead of this previously probably too low cost. You know, because the difference between pacifism and luminous bonds, 1 mana. That's it. That's the only difference. Luminous bonds is strictly worse because it costs 1 more mana, but pacifism was too good, so they took it out. And by having these rules and these staples of cards that get reprinted every so often in standard, especially in the core sets, that that enables them to, sort of build off of that power level and keep from getting too far away from it. Most of the time. Pokemon actually does a very similar thing. They have a bunch of cards that are considered staples and just basically always considered legal no matter how much the format rotates, and they always get printed again and again in every set, no matter what else gets added on top of the set. And so they can base the power level off of that and not have to deal with as much power creep as you might get in a game like Yu-Gi-Oh!, which doesn't do anything to mitigate power creep because why bother? Now, of course, the reason that games power creep in the first place is because they want to sell more cards. And the only reason you'd buy the new cards is if they're better than your old cards, right? Not really. The real answer is they don't have to be better, just different. Magic the Gathering, as far as I'm concerned, has gotten really good at this lately, where they introduce a bunch of new mechanics every standard set and, leave them behind and move on and introduce a bunch of new ones. The reason they do that, even though it's annoying for legacy support, as I mentioned in previous videos, is because seeing these cool new mechanics creates sparks of interest in players and, ooh, how can I build around this? How can I make the best use of this cool new idea? Ooh, this completely changes the way I think about things because it's, like in Ikoria, right? They turned keywords into counters, and they created this whole system where you can stack monsters on top of each other like enchantments to make them stronger, and that's a whole new way to play. It's not necessarily more powerful than previous ways to play, but it's a whole new way to play. And Magic the Gathering actually has one more really cool trick up its sleeve for making people buy the new sets instead of just sticking with what they've got. One, the format rotates so they have to, which is not a cool trick. That's just bad, but whatever. But two, the nostalgia factor, right? Like when they say, hey, we're going back to Dominaria for the first time in 15 years. Pack your bags. Let's get some artifacts and some legendary stuff and this new historic mechanic and all that. Cool. That was fun. They introduced this whole new artwork for legendary creatures and stuff. And they introduced the legendary sorcery mechanic, which is really bad, but whatever. It was just kind of fun to have things like Llanowar elves again. Just yeah, we're in Dominaria again, And it, pretty much since then, they've kept doing that. I mean, you could even argue they've been doing that since Return to Ravnica because, you know. But but I would argue that the nostalgia wasn't necessarily a huge part of the marketing in sets like Shadows over Innistrad. Like that set has nothing to do with the first Innistrad set. Like it's more to do with the block than anything else. Which, side note, I hate that they got rid of blocks. It was so fun. Blocks were so inventive and interesting, and like they kind of still design in blocks anyway. Like, you know, 2 years ago or whatever when they did the Ravnica sets, and like there were two Ravnica sets, and then there was War of the Spark, which had a bunch of planeswalkers and multicolored support as well. And so like you had three sets in a row with tons of multicolored support and all kinds of cool stuff going on. And then like a little while later we got like you know Throne of Eldraine followed immediately, which had like adamant, like monocolored support, right? And then immediately after that we got Theros, which had devotion and shit all over again. And then Ikoria didn't really have any monocolored support, but like it certainly didn't have any multicolored support. um, so like I don't know, I think blocks were cool, and they certainly made, you know, the design more cohesive and interactive and fun and like, but whatever. It also meant that like one mechanic could have a little bit more room to grow, right? Because like, if you introduce something in the first set of the block and then people really like it, you can keep it in the second and third sets of the block. And now there's like more than one set worth of cards that support this mechanic, since you're not going to come back to it for 10 years anyway. Uh, but yeah, aside from a few outliers that are probably design mistakes, um, Magic the Gathering is pretty good about keeping the power level of standard fairly consistent across sets. Now, so if you want to avoid power creep and keep a careful eye on the power level of your cards in general, one of the best things you can do for your game is create staple cards with a level amount of power and create guidelines for how much power cards are able to have. This is also a lot easier if your game has resource as cost, right? If you have mana or energy or whatever you want to call it, you can create very simple rules. For example, you know, um, a one mana effect equals a 1/1 creature, right? A two mana effect equals a creature with an effect. Like not a huge effect, but a little one, and create some rules for how those things trade off. For example, in Magic the Gathering, you can have a 2-drop that is a 2/3 or a 1/4 or something, and or a 2-drop that is a 1/1 with a decent effect. Like those are cards that exist, and decide what effect is worth what amount of stats on a creature. Um, Also, if your game has colors, and if you're doing resource costs, I highly recommend you have colors. Try not to just copy Magic's 5-color system because, like, you know, but but having conflicting energy sources does allow you to play with cost a lot more. So, for example, you could have a card that costs 3 different colors of energy. Well, that makes it a lot harder to play than a card that costs 1 color of energy, right? Even if it's the same cost for the card. So the card that requires 3 colors can be twice as strong as the card that requires 1 color, because it's effectively 2 to 3 times harder to summon, you know? Of course, if you take this route, you have to consider how easy it is to get the diverse resource colors. For example, in Magic the Gathering, they'll sometimes print standard sets where there are, gates and, lots of effects that can tap for any color of mana and things like that. And then multicolored cards aren't super rare or insanely overpowered compared with monocolored cards in that set. A lot of card games will have every card as resource, similar to Vanguard or the Dragon Ball Super card game. where any card can be placed in the resource row and tapped for mana effectively. And in this case, mixing colors is much easier because, well, any card can be included in the deck and used for mana. So in that case, multicolored cards might not be as powerful compared to monocolored cards because they're not that much more difficult to get. But in a game like Magic, where the default method of summoning an Is It monster is, half your mana is blue, half of it's red, and depending on the format, you might have some dual lands in there, you can make an Is It card a lot more powerful than a regular red or blue card of the same cost. On the other hand, you can also make cards more flexible, but weaker. This is Magic's hybrid mana system, which they often don't use in that way, but if you're balancing your game properly, you should use it in that way. Effectively, a card that has hybrid mana can be summoned using either color on the hybrid mana symbol. So, if a card is both white and black and hybrid mana, you can play either white or black to summon it, or both. If, it requires two symbols. This effectively means that in a deck that is running both white and black, this hybrid card is way easier to summon than a dual-costed card, and it can be splashed into decks that run only white or only black. This incredibly high level of flexibility over even monocolored cards means that it really should be less powerful than a monocolored card of the same relative cost. But not by an extreme amount, just a little bit, like 80% is good as a monocolored card, something like that. If you don't want your game to have mana, though, if you want to emulate Yu-Gi-Oh, for example, then you have to think about what other kinds of costs your card can have to justify their value. I, for one, think Yu-Gi-Oh does an absolutely horrible job of this. For example, there is no difference in cost between a level 1 creature and a level 1 monster and a level 4 monster. But there's often a huge gap in stats. Most level 1 monsters have like 100 attack, and most level 4 monsters can be, over 1600, right? Which is absurd because they're the same cost to summon. They take up the same amount of space in the deck, and they have the same value on the field. I believe this is a design holdover from the Bandai version of the game, which is a completely different game, and really has nothing to do with the actual value of the card. But it's a weird thing to have held on to for so long. Realistically, there should be, 3 levels. Level 1 can be summoned automatically. Level 2 needs a tribute, and level 3 needs 2 tributes, right? Like, that's how it should have been when they first started the game. Now, obviously, Yu-Gi-Oh has been able to make use of these different levels to make, synchros and exes and things like that require levels to function. But prior to those advancements, they had no gameplay purpose. I guess you could argue rituals required levels, but who played rituals back in the day? No one. Fucking no one. Not even the TV show played ritual monsters back in the day. I mean, they played Relinquished, and that was it. BLS did show up, but they never ritual summoned him. No, I think they did once. But realistically, until cards like Gishki and Nekros came out, there were no ritual players. None. So, in any case, in your game, you should not do what Yu-Gi-Oh did and consider how costly the card is when considering how powerful it is. Back in the day, Summon Skull had 1 less attack power than Red Eyes, but could be summoned with, or had more attack power than Red Eyes, but could be summoned with 1 fewer tributes, right? It had a lower cost and a higher damage output. Why does Red Eyes exist? Gameplay-wise, there's no reason. So if you're planning to build a game that doesn't have direct mana cost, think about how powerful a card has to be in order to, justify its other cost, right? If a card costs, you know, 10% of your player's health, what kind of effect does that equal, right? Because the immediate answer might not be the right one, right? Like for example, in Yu-Gi-Oh, there's a there's a trap card that costs 2,000 health to negate a summon out of your starting total of 8,000, right? That's a quarter of your health to stop the summoning of one monster. And that card is often played as a 3 of. You know, even to this day, some decks will play it as a 3 of. You know, there's another version of that card that costs half your health, whatever your current total is. And that card is considered better because, late in the game when you have less health, you can still play it. So please consider what the actual cost of your card is, and keep in mind that life points frequently do not matter until the very last ones. Exactly how true this is depends on how much healing is available in your game, but even in games where no healing is used, most players don't care about their health until it gets right down to the wire. I can tell you, as a dedicated goblin main in Magic the Gathering, I don't give a shit how much damage you deal to me until I'm one hit away from dying, because I will get you there first, because there are 1,000 goblins in this deck, and you will see all of them. You might think that's an exaggeration if you haven't read Krenko or Mogus. Like, Jesus Christ, Magic the Gathering Arena, what are you doing? Why did you put Moxus in the game? Oh, man. Anyway, goblins are fun, is what I'm saying. No, wait, I think his name is Muxus. Something like that. It's really stupid. Anyway, the point is that when it comes to using card costs, life points often aren't a very meaningful cost. Part of the reason that Phyrexian mana got taken out of the game is because people would play cards without paying mana, because that was the whole point. And if you can pay a card for free, why not? You might say it's not free, it's 2 health, but like, who gives a shit? 10% of my health to get a free card? Are you kidding? I'll take that trade fucking 9 times in a row and win the game with my last 2 health. Don't fucking test me, said every single player of the game. So that's why Phyrexian mana doesn't exist anymore. The average player who doesn't really get into the competitive scene might look at a card and say, whoa, that costs 10% of my health, that's a lot, but it isn't. And any player who's experienced is going to be like, this card only costs health? Fuck yeah! So consider other costs. One popular choice in games like Yu-Gi-Oh! Is to discard or remove cards from the field or the graveyard. Now, removing cards from a graveyard is much less costly than removing them from the hand or field, but it is technically a cost. You do have to put effort into getting cards into the graveyard in the first place, which means you can't use these cards until that happens. So it does force the cards to be somewhat later on in the game, and it does force them to compete with each other for that resource, because obviously only so many cards from your deck will end up in the graveyard throughout the course of the game anyway. So if you have 10 different cards that all want, 5 cards out of the grave in order to function, you're going to have to pick which ones you actually end up playing. So it can end up being a cost if you use it enough, but it's not as much of a cost to the player as a discard or a remove from the field effect. And keep in mind that the more discard and remove from field effects you have, the less of a cost removing something from the graveyard ends up being. Same thing goes for milling. Self-milling is not a cost at all, and it sets up the graveyard for those graveyard costs. So, like, eh. Another way to add a pretty much inherent cost to a card is to limit the number of cards that can be on the field. This is something Yu-Gi-Oh! Does. You have 5 slots for monsters, 7 now because they changed the board, but whatever. Actually, I guess 9 if you count the pendulum zones as like monster zones, even though they're not considered monsters in those zones. I don't know. And you normally have 6 spots for spells and traps, one of which is only for field spells, but whatever. And I guess if you're playing pendulums, you only have 3 spell and trap slots because the pendulum zones have to go to your pendulum monsters. But again, Anyway, the point is that by limiting how many cards can be on the field at one time, each card has an inherent cost, right? By playing this card, you reduce the number of other cards you can play. If your entire back row is filled, you can't activate a spell from your hand because your back row is filled. So, yeah. So limiting the field space inherently creates a cost to cards that is regardless of whether or not they have a cost printed on them. This effect is even more pronounced in Duel Links, where there are only 3 spots for monsters and 3 spots for spells and traps, plus the field spell zone, because of course. And many monsters that, might have been considered not very good in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are really fucking powerful in Duel Links, and vice versa, because that smaller space, combined with a smaller deck and smaller life point total, really changes the way that you have to approach combat and deck building and the field in general. The total impact of a card matters a lot more when there's less space to play cards. Getting a +1 in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is great. Getting a +1 in Duel Links is a fucking beastly. So if you're trying to create cost without mana, consider the size of your board. Consider life points, discarding, sacrificing. Consider, maybe a card comes in and gives your opponent some sort of benefit because, as a cost, right? Instead of saying, when you play this card, discard a card, say, when you play this card, your opponent draws 1, right? Like, that's deadly. That's a really high cost, right? You can also have special cards that have secondary cost systems. For example, in Yu-Gi-Oh, you can have things like spell counters, right? Whenever you play a spell, put a counter on this card, right? Well, you could then have a card that says, in order to play this card, remove 5 spell counters from anywhere on your field, So this card effectively can't be played in a deck that doesn't have spell counters, and it requires a certain amount of setup to do that. And it requires a certain amount of setup, even in a deck that has the cards for it, you can't play it on turn 1 right away. So consider things like that are alternate costs that can be built off of existing cards on the field in order to create a cost for your card to balance out its power. It's also worthwhile to consider how frequently your effect can be used and how long it takes to go into effect. For example, in Yu-Gi-Oh, there are lots of cards that have delayed effects, like Gold Sarcophagus, or that have effects that play out over several turns, like Reckless Greed, or, Swords of Revealing Light. And, how useful those effects are depends on how long they take, right? Like, the Gold Sarcophagus is a cool idea, right? You get to search for anything, but because there's a 2-turn delay on it, kind of pointless. No one uses it, right? It's not strong enough because of that 2-turn delay. It never was strong enough because of that 2-turn delay, right? Conversely, Reckless Greed lets you draw 2 cards and then skip your next 2 draw phases, right? You don't actually get a plus over the course of that length of time, but you do get those 2 cards now instead of later, and you know, maybe you won't need later if those 2 cards are good enough, right? Of course, most people don't play Reckless Greed because it's a trap card, and trap cards inherently have a waiting timer added onto them. You have to set the card before it can be activated, and it can't be flipped face up until it's been set for one whole end phase, right? This is another great way to balance out the cost of cards. And Yu-Gi-Oh! Has never really understood this, but, in the early days they were better about it than they are now, but cards that have an inherent weighting on them can be much more powerful than cards that don't have to wait, right? Spell cards should always be weaker than trap cards because spells can be used right away and traps have to wait. As I said, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has never understood this, but a new game that takes a similar formula could take that into account and make sure that those balances are issued. There are other ways you can cost out cards as well. Take, for example, Exodia, right? You get all 5 cards in your hand, you win. You win the game for having a 5-card combo in the hand. Not on the field, in the hand. And you might think getting 5 specific cards to the hand wouldn't be that difficult. But it is. It so is. It's so difficult that Exodia decks have basically never been very good. DZ also did a video about that. Which is why it also shouldn't surprise anyone that the Destiny board, which is basically the same effect but plays out over the course of 5 turns instead of, whenever you draw the cards, is even worse. Like so much worse. So it's possible, and in fact easy, to put very powerful effects, even win conditions, on cards that require a lot of setup, right? Exodia may not be, that hard in theory, but a 5-card combo is a 5-card combo, and that is a lot to ask. In Magic the Gathering, most combos are 3 cards or less, and even then, 3 cards can be pretty hard to set up consistently. And again, Magic has better draw effects than Yu-Gi-Oh! One other way you can add balance is, again, restricting the number of cards even further. For example, in Pokemon, the way you play monsters is totally different from how you do it in Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh, right? You have way less monster availability, and only one of them can be in the battle zone at a time. And so in that way, right, if you have to condense one of your card types down to one slot, you can have any number of crazy effects on it, and it's inherently balanced, at least to a certain degree, by the fact that it's the only one you can play. That's another interesting thing to bring up, is the idea of cards that have limited availability on the field or in the deck. I don't know of any games that have cards which are inherently limited by have an inherently limited quantity per deck. But Yu-Gi-Oh! Does have the Forbidden Limited list, where cards that, are at 1, you can only have 1 copy per deck. Cards that are at 2, you can only have 2 copies per deck, as opposed to the normal 3 copies per deck for any regular card. But Magic the Gathering has a great way to mitigate the impact of cards on the field without necessarily affecting deck building, which is the legendary cards. Now, this mechanic has changed a lot over the years, but in its current form, basically, each player can have one copy of each legendary card, um, and only one copy, right? You can have your one Jace the Mind Sculptor, but you can't have another Jace the Mind Sculptor unless you work around the rule by creating copies that don't count as legendary, because fuck the rules, right? Just just Helm of the Host that bitch and move on with your life. Just quasi duplicate it and go on. Just, uh. But, if Wizards of the Coast didn't have this insane maniacal need to undermine their own game mechanics, it would be a pretty cool way to balance things so that you only have one copy of this really powerful card at a time. And that is one way you can consider adding, inherent balance to certain powerful cards without having to restrict other cards in your game, right? Magic the Gathering doesn't have a restrictive field size, but it does have the Legends rule, so you still can't play 2 Zurgo Helm Smashers because that's not how it works. That's just not how it works. Side note, Zurgo Helm Smasher is so fun and so stupid. I love it. I literally play a mono red deck that goes Abzan just for Zurgo. Just Zurgo. It's brilliant. It's stupid. Don't do it. It's retarded. I love it. Anyway. Actually, Zurgo is a great example of a card that's pretty strong, but nowhere near overpowered, right? So Zurgo 1 has a very high cost, and it comes in 3 colors, right? Red, black, and white. And he's got pretty low stats for that cost. He's like... Okay, so he costs 5 mana, including 1 red, 1 white, and 1 black. He's a 7/2 with haste that has to attack each turn unless there's, like a binding effect or whatever. He also has indestructible, but only on your turn, meaning that any sorcery speed removal your opponent might have totally kills it. And whenever he kills something, he gets a teensy little bit stronger with a 1/1 counter. Effectively, playing Zurgo means that you will always be attacking and trying to break through your opponent's defenses. But it's not like it's hard to block him with any random creature. You don't really lose a whole lot by blocking with, say, tokens. He doesn't trample. He doesn't, do anything if you block him. He just gets blocked. He doesn't die during his combat, but you can kill him with any spell you happen to have on your turn. And because he taps down to attack every turn, he's never useful as a blocker. Despite all of this, it takes quite a lot of setup, and in the end, this is a card that I expect most people would say is not worth the cost. But it's still kind of fun to build a deck around a card like that. That's just does one thing fairly well, even if it has weaknesses. And I think that's a good direction for card design in general. Figure out one thing that you want your card or deck or whatever to do, and find ways to make that card very focused in that direction, while still providing strengths and weaknesses that, are pretty easy to see, right? Like, if you want a card that is really good at attacking, that's a great freaking example of that. If you instead want a card that's really good at blocking, right? Give it Defender, give it 6 defense, right? Make it indestructible, and just plop that wall down. Think about what you want a card to do and focus on that thing. Don't try to make every card Zatalpa the Primal Dawn, Just give it a few things that connect into this one goal and run with it, And it's okay if it isn't perfectly protected, or if, it has a blind spot in this other application, right? Maybe this card is really good at attacking, but Because of that, it's kind of useless in defending in or it doesn't have any effects that like help the board when you're not attacking, things like that. Um, and by doing that, you can create a balance where this card is like usable, it serves a purpose, and it's good in its own way, but it's not overpowered. Most people would immediately see how they can get rid of it. Like, it's easy to get rid of, but it's also, you know, a card that has an immediate impact and does a thing it's trying to do really well. So, yeah, I think that's a good design lesson in general. Like, whatever it is you want your card to focus on that thing and do it really well and leave obvious weaknesses that, invite counterplay. Now, that's not to say you can't have a card that's more general. It's just that a card that's more general should cost more than a card that's specific. If a card has four effects that all basically amount to this card is really good at attacking, it might still cost less than a card that has two effects that amount to this card is really good at attacking and really good at defending. You know, um, like that's not an unreasonable way to look at card design. And people might just say that like, hey, if you're going to play three colors, you should play Thragtusk. you know Ristic Studies did a whole video about like how that design came to be and why it's so broken. um you know but to my mind, like, Thragtusk is an accident, and you shouldn't use it as inspiration for future card design. You should be looking to make more cards that are, more moderate and more focused and more like zoomed in on a specific thing that they're good at. Um, and when you do make something general, make it cost more. That's fair. So, yeah, that's just a little bit of how you can start thinking about card power when designing your own games and what you might want that to look like for you. So, yeah. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next live. Laters. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you have any things to say about it, leave those in the comment section. If you like the video, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, share the video, tell your friends, start a cult, sacrifice your firstborn and paint their skull golden. I don't know, not that last bit. No human sacrifices. I'm legally liable. No, none of that shit. But, I got Facebook, Twitter, Twitch. I stream on Mondays. I also have a Patreon, but the obvious caveat with Patreon is you never donate to anyone unless you have money to burn. And if you have money to burn, then why not donate to a charity instead? I've got a few linked in my description at all times. I'm not affiliated with any of them, obviously, but yeah, I just thought they were cool. So, thanks for watching.